1947, Red Wharf Bay, Anglesey, Wales. A man is standing on a beach at low tide. His name is Maurice Wilkes. He is the chief engineer of the Rover Company. The sand in front of him is wet and flat. He crouches down and begins to draw. With his finger he traces the outline of a vehicle. Flat sides, open top, 4 wheels. Simple, almost childishly simple. His brother Spencer is watching. Spencer runs the company. When Maurice finishes, Spencer looks at the shape in the sand and says nothing for a moment. Then he nods. The next tide washed the drawing away. It was gone within the hour. The vehicle it described lasted 81 years. It had no armour. It had no gun. It weighed less than a medium-sized family car. Its canvas roof leaked in the rain. It had no heater as standard. Soldiers who drove it called it bone-shaking, deafening, and brutally uncomfortable. It fought in Korea. It fought in Malaya, in Kenya, in Cyprus, in Borneo, and in Oman. It hunted Scud missiles across the Iraqi desert. It crossed the peat bogs of East Falkland in the South Atlantic. It patrolled the streets of Belfast for 38 years. It served the British Army in every armed conflict from 1949 to 2015, and in some theatres well beyond that. Over 2 million were built. More than 100 nations operated them. The Special Air Service painted theirs pink and drove them 1,000 miles behind enemy lines. Its name was the Land Rover, and it was the most consequential British military vehicle of the 20th century, a machine that was never supposed to be built at all. To understand why the Land Rover existed, you need to understand the problem Britain faced in 1947. The Rover Company had survived the war by manufacturing jet engines at a shadow factory in Solihull. Their luxury car market had collapsed. Steel was rationed by the government, reserved for factories earning foreign currency through exports. Rover needed a product they could sell overseas, and they needed it fast. Maurice Wilkes had a surplus American Willys Jeep on his farm in Wales. He used it for agricultural work. He was impressed by what it could do, but the Jeep was wearing out and there was nothing British to replace it. Steel for a new car was impossible to obtain, but aluminium was everywhere. Britain had stockpiled vast quantities during the war for aircraft production. It was cheap, available, and critically, it did not rust. The first Land Rover prototype was built on a Jeep chassis, using Jeep axles and a Rover car engine. The body panels were aluminium. The engineers designed power takeoffs in all directions, because Maurice had insisted the vehicle must work as a farm tool. It launched at the Amsterdam Motor Show on April 30th, 1948, and orders came in from across the world before the show had closed. The British Army placed its first trial order in 1949, 1,878 vehicles. That same year, British forces went to Korea. The Land Rovers went with them. The Army was also developing a dedicated military vehicle at the time, the Austin Champ. It was purpose-built, expensive, and packed with clever engineering. It cost roughly double the price of a Land Rover. Its rear axles broke constantly. Its maintenance was a nightmare. 11,732 were built before the contract was cancelled. By 1967, every Champ had been withdrawn. The Land Rover, the cheap agricultural stopgap, stayed. On August 2nd, 1958, the War Office made it official. The Land Rover was the standard quarter-ton tactical vehicle of the British Army. The vehicle that Maurice Wilkes had drawn in wet sand on a Welsh beach had beaten everything the government could throw against it. Not through brilliance, through simplicity. The Series 3 appeared in 1971. It was not a revolution. It was a refinement. The gearbox gained full synchromesh across all 4 forward gears, ending the double declutching that earlier crews had cursed. The dashboard moved to the driver's side. The instrument layout improved. The chassis was strengthened. The axles were toughened. The engine was a 2.25-litre 4-cylinder petrol unit, producing 70 brake horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute. It was not powerful. It was not fast. The military imposed a 45-mile-per-hour speed limit because the suspension had no interest in going faster than that. Ground clearance was 200 millimetres at the differential. Wading depth was 500 millimetres unprepared. The 45-litre fuel tank gave an operational range of roughly 160 to 200 miles on good roads, considerably less off them. None of those numbers sound impressive. Every one of them was exactly what the Army needed. The fuel tank could be refilled from a jerry can, a bucket, or a fuel bowser. The engine could be stripped and rebuilt with hand tools in a field. Spare parts existed on every base the British Army had ever occupied. A trained mechanic could fault-find the entire vehicle in his sleep. When it broke, which was rarely, it could be fixed. That reliability, that fundamental simplicity was not an accident. It was the design philosophy. Military variants came in several configurations. The standard general service model carried personnel and equipment. The fitted for radio variant carried communications equipment and ran on a 24-volt electrical system. The lightweight stripped the body to its minimum, removing doors, windscreen, roof and upper panels, reducing weight enough to be carried underslung beneath a Westland Wessex helicopter. 37,897 lightweights were built across all marks, serving more than 20 nations. Then there was the 101-inch forward control. It shared almost nothing with the Series 3 except the name. It used a 3.5-litre Rover Vate engine producing approximately 120 brake horsepower, with permanent four-wheel drive and a 1-ton payload. Its entire purpose was to tow the L118 105mm light gun, with a crew of 6 and 1 ton of ammunition, across any terrain Britain might send its soldiers into. 2,669 were built, all military. Now, before we get into where the Land Rover actually fought, if you are finding this deep dive into British military history worthwhile, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel grow. April 1982. Choiseul Sound, East Falkland, South Atlantic. On the 8th of June, a landing craft was making its way from Goose Green to Fitzroy, carrying Royal Signals Land Rovers forward to support the final push on Port Stanley. The landing craft was designated Foxtrot 4. Its coxswain was Colour Sergeant Brian Johnston of the Royal Marines, who had already earned the Queen's Gallantry Medal for rescuing more than 100 survivors from the burning wreck of a warship just 2 weeks earlier. 4 Argentine Skyhawk jets came in low from the east. A 500-pound bomb hit the stern of the landing craft. 6 crew were killed. Colour Sergeant Johnston was among them. The surviving 11 men were pulled from the water by helicopter. Attempts to tow the stricken craft failed. It drifted through the night and disappeared. It has never been found. Somewhere on the seabed off the south coast of East Falkland, at 40 to 60 metres depth, lie the remains of Foxtrot 4. The Land Rovers it was carrying lie with it. That is not a minor footnote. It is the story in miniature. Land Rovers were everywhere in the Falklands because the British Army ran on Land Rovers. 29th Commando Regiment Royal Artillery deployed 18 101 forward controls as gun tractors for their 105mm light guns, plus 18 further Land Rovers across its batteries. 12th Air Defence Regiment brought 12 more forward controls as Rapier missile tractors. Signals, logistics, headquarters, medical, engineering units, all of them moved on Land Rovers. The terrain nearly defeated them. East Falkland had almost no roads. The ground was deep peat bog. Vehicles sank. Tracks disappeared. The famous yomps and tabs that the Parachute Regiment and Royal Marines became famous for were necessary precisely because wheeled vehicles could not cross the ground fast enough. Land Rovers that were offloaded at San Carlos Bay had to be ferried to Stanley by sea after the war ended, because they could not drive overland at any useful speed, and yet the vehicles that could reach the front reached it. The 105mm guns fired. The Rapier batteries put missiles in the air. The signals links held. The Land Rovers that did not sink in the peat did the job they were sent to do. January 1991. The western desert of Iraq, approximately 139 kilometres inside the Iraqi border. The Special Air Service had been operating in this country since the 17th of January, when Saddam Hussein began launching Scud missiles at Israel, and coalition commanders needed someone to find them and destroy them. 2nd Lieutenant General Peter de la Billière, who had served with the regiment in the Oman and elsewhere, had argued for an SAS role when the American General Staff had doubted it. A and D squadrons of 22nd SAS Regiment were operating as fighting columns. Each half squadron was allocated 8 Land Rover 110 Desert Patrol vehicles, 1 Mercedes Unimog for bulk supplies, and motorcycles for forward scouting. The Land Rovers had been stripped of doors, windscreens and mirrors. Each carried twin general-purpose machine guns on forward mounts, with a 50 caliber Browning heavy machine gun or a 40mm grenade launcher on the rear ring mount. 4 fuel tanks gave 100 gallons of capacity and a range of more than 1,000 miles. The headlights and brake lights had been removed. They drove north into Iraq by night and lay up under camouflage nets during the day. On the 7th and 8th of February, a squadron conducted an assault on an Iraqi Scud communications facility. The regimental sergeant major, Peter Ratcliffe, commanded the fire support group as Land Rovers with 50 caliber guns and grenade launchers hammered the objective from multiple directions while assault elements destroyed the installation with explosives. Ratcliffe was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. He later described the operation in direct terms. The vehicles held, the guns held, the plan worked. The same vehicles also ran a resupply convoy, 139 kilometers inside Iraqi territory, to a rendezvous at a location designated Wadi Tubal on the 15th of February. Approximately 390 non-commissioned officers were present at what Ratcliffe subsequently called the largest gathering of SAS personnel in a battle zone since the end of World War II. Land Rovers formed the escort column. All of this was done in vehicles that cost a fraction of any contemporary armoured vehicle. Vehicles that any trained mechanic could fix. Vehicles that had been designed to plough a Welsh farm. In Northern Ireland, the Land Rover's story was different, harder, and ultimately more painful. Operation Banner ran for 38 years, from 1969 to 2007, the longest continuous deployment in the history of the British Army. In the early years, soldiers patrolled in standard soft-skin Land Rovers with no armour whatsoever. The army was taking casualties at a rate it had not experienced since Korea. In 1972 alone, the Irish Republican Army killed 100 soldiers and wounded 500. The response was the Vehicle Protection Kit. Glass-reinforced plastic panels bolted to standard Series 3 Land Rovers. Fitting took 32 to 35 man-hours. Then came Macrolon, a transparent polycarbonate ballistic glass that resisted pistol rounds, fragments and petrol bombs, but offered no protection against high-velocity rifle fire. The Heavy Vehicle Protection Kit, produced by GKN Sankey from around 1980, addressed that. Hardened, bolt-on steel armour, armoured glass windscreen, weight over 2,500 kilograms unladen, loading the chassis to its absolute structural limit. Nicknamed the Piglet. It worked in the streets and it worked in the housing estates. It was not enough for the South Armagh countryside, where culvert bombs buried beneath roads could lift a vehicle 30 feet into the air and throw it 30 yards into a field. In rural South Armagh, all troop movements eventually had to be made by helicopter. The Piglet could not fix that. The Snatch Land Rover came later, in 1992. Built on the Defender 110 chassis, armoured by NP Aerospace, designed for riot control and snatch squad operations in Belfast and Londonderry. In Northern Ireland, it was adequate. The problem came when the same vehicle was deployed to Iraq after 2003 and to Afghanistan after 2006, against threats it had never been designed to survive. The improvised explosive device was not a petrol bomb, it was not a rifle round. Soldiers began calling the Snatch the mobile coffin. At least 37 died in them from hostile action. That is the darkest chapter of the Land Rover's military story. A vehicle stretched beyond what it could honestly do, deployed into a threat environment its designers had never imagined. The failures were not in the original design. They were in the decisions made about when and where to deploy it. On paper, the Land Rover's rivals all looked better in certain respects. The Austin Champ had more sophisticated engineering. The Mercedes Unimog had greater payload and better ground clearance. The Soviet UAZ 469 had portal axles and 300mm of clearance against the Land Rover's 200. Each of those vehicles had something the Land Rover lacked. None of them replaced it. The Champ was gone by 1967. The Unimog served alongside the Land Rover as a heavier alternative, not a substitute. The UAZ suffered from inconsistent manufacture, oil seal failures, and fractured components. The Land Rover kept working. It kept being repaired. It kept being bought, in variant after variant, by armies who had tried everything else. More than 5,000 remained in British military service as late as March 2025, when the Army formally announced the beginning of their retirement, targeting complete withdrawal by 2030. 81 years of service, not a record any vehicle achieves by accident. 1947, Red Wharf Bay. A man crouches on a wet beach and draws a shape with his finger. Flat sides, open top, 4 wheels. No sophistication, no complexity. Just the minimum a vehicle needed to go anywhere and carry something useful. It had no heater. The roof leaked. The ride was brutal. The noise was constant. Soldiers who drove thousands of miles in them called them terrible and drove them again anyway. in the peat bogs of East Falkland, in the sand of the Iraqi Western Desert, on the streets of Belfast for 38 continuous years, in the jungles of Borneo, the mountains of Oman, the frozen approaches to the Norwegian Arctic. The Land Rover did not win those wars alone. It was never supposed to. It was supposed to be reliable, simple, repairable, and present. It was always present. The tide washed the drawing away within the hour. The machine it became lasted 81 years. That is not luck. That is British engineering stripped to what actually matters. That is not luck. That is British engineering